What happens when the law itself becomes an instrument of racial oppression? A young boy's life hangs in the balance, but a twist of fate may expose the deep flaws within the judicial system, one that could lead to a historic fight for justice. Will the truth prevail before it's too late? The air in the Jackson, Mississippi federal courtroom was thick with tension. The walls, lined with dark wood and the weight of history, seemed to close in around the young boy standing at the defense table. 14-year-old Jamal Turner stood stiffly, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes scanning the jury, a jury that had already made up its mind. The crime? A robbery and assault he didn't commit. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features and a confident smirk, had spent the last hour twisting the evidence. He painted Jamal as a menace, a boy with a troubled past, though no such past existed. His words dripped with conviction, each statement filled with the kind of certainty that made the truth irrelevant. The jury nodded along, their expressions hardened. Maya Brooks, Jamal's defense attorney, stood beside him, her fists clenched just as tightly. She had fought against impossible odds before, but this time the deck was stacked higher than ever. The evidence was weak, but in this courtroom that didn't matter. The judge, Judge Randall Mathis, was well known for his bias, and the way he smirked from the bench told Maya everything she needed to know. This trial was a formality. The verdict had already been decided. Jamal shifted on his feet, trying to block out the cold stares of the people watching. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a threat. He was just a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the system didn't care about that. Maya took a steady breath, stepping forward. "Your Honor, the evidence against my client is circumstantial at best. There are inconsistencies in the witness testimonies, no clear forensic proof, and a video that proves he was blocks away when the crime took place." Judge Mathis sighed, barely hiding his irritation. "And yet, here we are, Miss Brooks. If your argument was so compelling, we wouldn't be wasting the court's time." The prosecutor chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if Maya's defense was nothing more than an inconvenience. The jury exchanged glances, already convinced. Jamal's heart pounded. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the ghosts of those who had stood in courtrooms like this before him, innocent, accused, powerless. The judge's gavel slammed against the bench. "We'll take a short recess before closing arguments." His eyes met Jamal's, cold and dismissive. "Don't go anywhere, son. We'll be wrapping this up soon." Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat, his gaze shifting to Maya. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, whispering, "It's not over yet." But as he looked around the courtroom, the weight of injustice settling over him, he wasn't so sure. Have you ever seen or experienced injustice firsthand? Let's talk. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? The courtroom was silent except for the ticking of the clock. The jury had been deliberating for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been 30 minutes. That was all it took for them to decide the fate of 14-year-old Jamal Turner. His mother, Tanya Turner, sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. Tears threatened to spill from her tired eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until she knew her son's fate. Jamal sat beside his attorney, Maya Brooks, staring straight ahead. His fingers gripped the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded in his chest, a heavy rhythm of fear and helplessness. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." Judge Randall Mathis entered, his expression unreadable, but the smirk that curled at the edge of his mouth did not go unnoticed. The jury filed in, their faces blank. No remorse, no hesitation. Has the jury reached a verdict? Mathis asked, his voice calm, almost amused. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with a stiff posture, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom held its breath. On the charge of robbery and aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Jamal Turner, guilty on all charges. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tanya let out a strangled cry, her body shaking as she clutched the bench in front of her. Maya shot to her feet. "No, this is a miscarriage of justice." Jamal's mind went blank. The words echoed in his head, but they didn't feel real. Guilty. The judge nodded, as if this was the outcome he had expected all along. He leaned forward, his voice cold, unwavering. "In my courtroom, we don't tolerate criminals. I sentence you to death by lethal injection." A stunned silence fell over the room before it erupted into chaos. Tanya collapsed, sobbing, as family members shouted in disbelief. Maya's voice rang out above the noise. "You can't do this. He's a child. This isn't justice." Jamal couldn't breathe. His world tilted, the walls closing in around him. Death. They were going to kill him for something he didn't do. His hands shook, his legs felt weak, but all he could do was sit there as the weight of his sentence crushed him. The judge slammed his gavel. "This courtroom is adjourned." He stood and walked out, indifferent to the suffering he had just inflicted. Tears blurred Jamal's vision as officers approached to take him away. His mother's cries rang in his ears, but he couldn't move. He couldn't fight, because the system had already decided he wasn't worth saving. Do you think the system is rigged against people like Jamal? Why or why not? The courtroom was on the brink of chaos. Judge Randall Mathis lifted his gavel, ready to finalize the sentence that would seal Jamal Turner's fate. The weight of injustice pressed heavily on everyone except the man on the bench, whose smirk betrayed his eagerness to bring the trial to its predetermined conclusion. Then, "Stop! We have new evidence!" The words rang through the courtroom like a gunshot, freezing everyone in place. Heads turned, whispers filled the air, and the gavel halted mid-swing. A young journalist, Xavier Miles, pushed through the packed courtroom, clutching a thick folder of documents in one hand, a flash drive in the other. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his face glistening with sweat from the urgency of his arrival. Maya Brooks, Jamal's attorney, turned toward him, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice both wary and desperate. "Xavier Miles, investigative reporter," he said, barely catching his breath. "I have surveillance footage proving Jamal Turner was miles away when the crime took place." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, frantic movement. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly, his smirk long gone. "Order! Order! In this court!" But his voice was drowned out by the commotion. Tanya Turner, who had been sobbing moments ago, looked up in disbelief. Hope flickered in her tear-filled eyes. Jamal, still in shock, barely comprehended what was happening. Xavier pushed the folder into Maya's hands. Security footage from a gas station across town, time-stamped, undeniable. Jamal was there at the exact moment the robbery happened. He couldn't have committed this crime. Maya's hands shook as she flipped through the documents, scanning the images and reports. The evidence was irrefutable. She turned to the judge, her voice steady, powerful. "Your Honor, this changes everything. This court cannot move forward with sentencing when exculpatory evidence has come to light. I motion for an immediate dismissal of charges and Jamal Turner's release." The judge's expression hardened. His grip on the gavel tightened. This is highly irregular. What's irregular, Maya shot back, stepping forward, is that my client was about to be sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. The tension in the courtroom thickened. The prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments before, paled. The jury members exchanged uncertain glances. "Your Honor," Xavier said, his voice ringing clear and strong, "the people deserve to know the truth. This case was rushed, the evidence manipulated. The real criminal is still out there while an innocent boy was nearly executed. This is a miscarriage of justice." The murmurs grew into a roar of outrage. The judge's jaw clenched, his authority slipping as the weight of the moment settled over him. He had no choice. With reluctant force, he slammed the gavel down. "Court is adjourned until further review of the evidence." A mixture of relief and disbelief washed over the courtroom. Tanya collapsed into grateful sobs, gripping Jamal's hands as if she would never let go. Maya exhaled shakily, blinking back tears. Xavier stood firm, knowing this was only the beginning. Jamal, stunned but hopeful, whispered, "I thought it was over." Maya squeezed his shoulder. "Not today. Have you ever witnessed a last-minute twist of fate? Let's discuss." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the surveillance footage played on the screen. The grainy, black-and-white video showed Jamal Turner standing in a gas station miles away at the exact time of the crime. His posture was relaxed, completely unaware of the nightmare that would soon unfold around him. The prosecutor, a man who had spent weeks crafting a case against Jamal, turned visibly pale. His lips parted as if to object, but no words came. He glanced at the jury, searching for an anchor, but all he found were murmurs of disbelief. Maya Brooks, Jamal's defense attorney, stepped forward, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The undeniable proof that her client had been framed. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the rising whispers, "this evidence exonerates my client. This trial was based on racial bias, not facts. The prosecution pursued a conviction without properly investigating the truth." Judge Randall Mathis clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the gavel. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by something cold and unreadable. He refused to look at the screen, refused to acknowledge the truth that had just unraveled before him. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom as more images were shown. Jamal at the counter, purchasing a soda, a timestamp proving he was nowhere near the crime scene. Every second of footage chipped away at the false narrative the prosecution had built. The jury shifted uncomfortably. A few members exchanged guilty looks, as if realizing they had nearly condemned an innocent boy to death. One woman in the front row pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, horror dawning in her eyes. Tanya Turner, Jamal's mother, gripped the edge of the bench, her breath coming in shaky gasps. She had spent weeks preparing for the worst, bracing for the inevitable loss of her son. And now, in a single moment, the truth had shattered the walls of injustice built around him. Maya turned to the prosecutor. "You knew," she accused. "You pushed for a conviction despite flimsy evidence. You ignored anything that didn't fit your case." The prosecutor's throat bobbed as he struggled for a response. He began, but he had nothing to defend himself with. The audience erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and people shouted from the back, "This is corruption!" How many others have been wrongfully convicted? This judge needs to be investigated. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but the control he once held over the room had vanished. The case had collapsed, and with it, his credibility. Maya stood tall, unwavering. This wasn't just an oversight. This was intentional. The prosecution wanted a conviction at any cost, and you, Judge Mathis, allowed it to happen. You pushed this trial forward despite the lack of solid evidence. You refused to acknowledge the truth. The tension in the room thickened. The judge's face darkened, but he said nothing. He couldn't. The entire courtroom had seen the evidence. His authority, once absolute, was now crumbling beneath the weight of his own corruption. Jamal sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had spent weeks believing there was no escape, that the system would bury him regardless of his innocence. Now, for the first time, hope flickered inside him. The crowd's outrage only grew louder. The truth was out. The question now was, what would happen next? What do you think should happen to the judge and prosecutor? Drop your thoughts below. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Jamal Turner's supporters rose from their seats, shouting demands for justice. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as the scandal unfolded in real time. The revelation that Jamal had been wrongfully accused sent a wave of anger through the room, the weight of injustice pressing down on everyone present. Judge Randall Mathis, once so confident in his control, now found himself cornered. He looked out over the furious faces before him and tightened his grip on the gavel. His jaw clenched, his face pale. But there was no way out of this. The truth was undeniable, and the courtroom was turning against him. Maya Brooks took a step forward, her voice ringing with authority. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, I demand that all charges against Jamal Turner be immediately dismissed. This trial was built on lies and prejudice, and justice must be served. The prosecutor, still visibly shaken, shifted in his seat but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The walls were closing in, and there was no argument he could make to justify what had just been exposed. Judge Mathis looked down at the documents in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent years delivering verdicts without challenge, but this time the evidence was irrefutable. With a deep, reluctant sigh, he leaned forward and spoke into the microphone. In light of the new evidence, he said, his voice strained, the court overturns the verdict. Jamal Turner is hereby exonerated of all charges. A beat of silence passed. Then the room exploded with cheers and applause. Tanya Turner collapsed into tears, clutching her son as if she would never let go. Jamal, still in shock, barely processed what had just happened. He was free. The nightmare was over, or was it? Maya Brooks, though relieved, wasn't finished. She turned toward the judge and the prosecutor, her gaze hard as steel. This isn't just about Jamal. How many others have been sentenced unfairly? How many innocent people have been buried by this system? This ends today. A ripple of agreement swept through the audience. Chants for change filled the room. People demanded investigations, accountability, and consequences for those who had nearly taken Jamal's life. Judge Mathis shifted uncomfortably, his once unshakable authority crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. The prosecutor, now the subject of scathing glares, looked down at his hands, his career hanging in the balance. Outside, the crowd gathered. Protesters, community leaders, and activists held signs, their voices merging into one powerful demand: justice. The city would not let this case be forgotten. This was bigger than Jamal. It was about every wrongfully accused person who never got the chance to prove their innocence. As Jamal stepped outside, the sunlight hit his face, warm and real. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight on his chest begin to lift. His life had been changed forever. He had lost time, trust, and innocence. But as he looked at his mother, his lawyer, and the people who stood beside him, he knew one thing: he wasn't alone. Do you believe racial bias in the legal system can ever be fully erased? Let's talk. Days after the trial, the consequences of the case reverberated across the nation. The weight of Jamal Turner's wrongful conviction had sparked an outrage that could no longer be ignored. Headlines screamed for accountability, social media erupted with calls for justice, and the public demanded answers. Judge Randall Mathis, once untouchable in his courtroom, found himself at the center of an investigation. Legal experts combed through his past cases, uncovering a troubling pattern of racial bias in his sentencing. As the pressure mounted, his once imposing presence faded into disgrace. The same gavel he had used to condemn so many now symbolized his own downfall. The prosecutor, unable to escape the scrutiny of his actions, resigned in disgrace. His carefully crafted career, built on securing convictions rather than seeking truth, crumbled beneath the weight of his deception. He left his office in silence, his reputation forever tarnished. Meanwhile, Jamal walked free. But freedom was not the same as justice. He had spent weeks behind bars, fearing for his life, suffering under the weight of a system that had tried to bury him. The world around him had changed, but so had he. The innocence he had once carried was gone, replaced with a hardened resolve. His mother, Tanya Turner, never let go of his hand in the days following his release. She had nearly lost her son to a lie, and now she vowed to fight so no other mother would endure the same pain. Maya Brooks, the attorney who had fought tirelessly for him, stood before a sea of reporters, her voice unwavering. This isn't just about Jamal Turner. This is about every innocent person who has been denied justice. We must dismantle the system that allows this to happen. This is only the beginning. Protests erupted across the country. Crowds filled city streets, demanding reforms in the legal system. Activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens called for changes in jury selection, accountability for prosecutors, and an end to judicial bias. The case had become more than just one boy's fight for freedom. It was a movement. Jamal, though still reeling from everything he had endured, knew he had a purpose now. The fear that had once gripped him had transformed into determination. Standing before a group of young boys in his neighborhood, he spoke with quiet strength. "I almost lost my life to a lie. Now, I'll spend the rest of it making sure this never happens again." The world had tried to break him, but Jamal had emerged stronger. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter, and his battle had only just begun. What's the biggest lesson from Jamal's story? Let's discuss in the comments.